Westminster Symposium began some 7 years ago when then Senior Vice President and Dean of Faculty, Dr. Barney Forsyth, had an idea that connected to Westminster College's global vision. That idea was to turn the entire campus into a global classroom for 2 days to discuss critical issues facing us today. The intellectual debt of gratitude owed to Dr. Forsyth for the symposium has been embellished this year by the financial underwriting of this event by Jane and Barney Forsyth. I and the Symposium Committee thank you most deeply for that gift. This year we focus on religious experience in a global society, and given recent events globally, in the United States, around the world, the symposium, its subject, has taken on an even more significant hue. To frame this year's symposium, I'm delighted now to introduce the chair of the Symposium Committee, Dr. Cliff Cain. The Reverend Dr. Cliff Cain is Professor of Religious Studies at Westminster College, Chair of the 2011 Symposium Committee, and received his education at Princeton, Vanderbilt, Leiden University in the Netherlands, and Rikyo University in Japan. The holder of 2 doctorates and the author of 6 books, his most recent publication came out just this year and is entitled Many Heavens, One Earth. Dr. Cliff Cain.
My mother must be turning over in her grave. Let me say that to you again. My mother must be turning over in her grave. For growing up, I was taught that there were a few topics that were never appropriate for people to talk about, and never, ever, absolutely in a public setting. Politics, sex, and religion. My mother must be turning over in her grave. For we have gathered these 2 days to talk about religion. Religion is as polarizing as politics and as passionate as sex. Not surprisingly, religion elicits deep feelings from opposite perspectives. Some would die for their religion. Some would kill for their religion. Some wish religion was dead. Some wish everyone was religious. Some wish no one was religious. Religion is as polarizing as politics and as passionate as sex. Some contend that religion is about the mysterious. Some contend that religion is about the superstitious. Some say that religion is a force for good. Some say that religion is a force for evil. PBS journalist Bill Moyers observes that religion produces both sorts of behavior. Religion motivates charity and liberation, and religion precipitates crusades and oppression. Religion can be as divisive, as polarizing as politics, and as arousing, as passionate as sex. We have gathered to talk about religion. Also, and admittedly, religion is an incredibly broad topic. There are so many definitions of religion. Religion means so many things. Mathematician and philosopher Alfred North Whitehead defined religion as, quote, what the individual does with his or her solitariness, end of quote. Religion can and does include the individual's beliefs and personal piety. Physicist Albert Einstein declared that religion without science is blind, and that science without religion is lame. But sometimes religion impedes science, and sometimes science dismisses religion. Sociologist Emile Durkheim said that religion features the group rituals that we use to deal with life's passages and life's mysteries. Religion does involve forming social networks and facilitating the passing on of society's cultural myths and values. German philosopher Immanuel Kant equated religion with, quote, the recognition of our moral duties as divine commands, unquote. And yes, every religion does have some version in its ethics of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Christian writer C.S. Lewis declared that religion points us toward joy as the object of our longing, our yearning. Religion can be psychologically satisfied by putting us in contact with the numinous spiritual reality that we desire. Economist, political scientist, philosopher Karl Marx charged that religion is the opiate of the people that dulls their will to rise up and cast off exploitation. While Westminster College religious studies professor emeritus Bill Young taught that religion, quote, is human transformation in response to perceived ultimacy, end of quote. Harvard world religions professor Diana Eck wrote that pluralism in religion is one of the most pressing issues of the 21st century. There are so many different ways of being religious today. In our global community, there are at least 2 billion Christians, 1.5 billion Muslims, 1 billion Hindus, nearly 500 million Buddhists, and so forth. It is true that we cannot talk about religion in the year 2012. We must talk about religions. Religion is each of these things. Religion is all of these things. Religion is a broad topic. And so we've gathered to talk about religion and religions. We're here to talk about religious experience in global society. To be able to focus a symposium on a number of these issues and across this incredibly broad expanse under the humongous umbrella of religion, there must, of course, be a committee. A committee composed of college administrators, of faculty divisional representatives from the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities, and of students from varied perspectives. We've had such a committee working on this symposium for nearly 12 months. And I would like to briefly recognize the 2012 symposium committee members. The persons on this committee did extensive, loyal, hard, and diligent work to plan this year's event. Please hold your applause while I ask the members of the symposium committee to stand as I call out their names. When all have risen, we'll go ahead and thank them collectively with our applause. The 2012 symposium committee members are Accounting Professor Elise Bartley, Biology Professor Gabe McNett, Philosophy and Religious Studies Professor Jim McCrae, Vice President of the Churchill Institute and Executive Director of the National Churchill Museum, Dr. Rob Havers, Vice President and Dean of the College, Dr. Carolyn Parry, Director of the Center for Engaging the World, Dr. Kurt Jefferson, Senior Student Emily Grand, Senior Student Gaurav Kanal, Senior Student Andrew Robertson, Senior Student Annie Collio, and the Capture the Moment Photography Club officers who masterminded that beautiful photo exhibit outside in the lobby, and Administrative Assistant Mita Young. Join me in applauding their efforts. Committee members should be seated. This committee has scheduled 5 plenary sessions, and a plethora, oodles of breakout sessions. Plenary session number 1 will address religious pluralism in terms of interfaith dialogue among the world religions in the face of the environmental challenges besetting us as a global community. This plenary will be led by Baird Callicott. Plenary number 2 will address the case for theism. What are the grounds for belief in God? This plenary will be led by Doug Guyvet. Plenary number 3 will address the case for atheism. What are the grounds for disbelief? This plenary will be led by Dan Barker. Plenary number 4 will address religion and ethics, in essence, the moral values in the international community's business relationships. This plenary will be led by David Shana. Plenary number 5 will address science and religion in light of the contentious issue of the relationship between biological evolution and religious faith. This plenary will be led by Eugenie Scott. Please join me in thanking all of these plenary speakers for being here and sharing their thoughts with us. And we have nearly 20 breakout sessions that will focus on religion and art, religion and film, religion and music, religion and sport, the African American church and the civil rights movement, Native American spirituality, religion and social justice, just war theory in Christianity and Islam, Jewish-Christian relations in light of the Holocaust, religion and gender issues, militancy and nonviolence in the Sikh religion, thoughts and issues in the translation of sacred texts, misconceptions of Islam, religion and public education, and discussions with each of the 5 plenary speakers. Please join me in thanking our breakout session leaders for their presence as a part of our symposium. So, 5 plenaries, nearly 20 breakout sessions, all this, and in just 2 days. I'm sorry, Mom, we have gathered to talk about religion. So I invite you to be engaged, to be stimulated, to be challenged, to be fed, to be comfortable, to be uncomfortable, to grow, and most of all, to enjoy. And now it's my pleasure to introduce briefly to you President Barney Forsyth. Dr. Forsyth originally came to Westminster College to become the Senior Vice President and Dean of Faculty in 2006 after serving in a similar capacity at the United States Military Academy. He was a career officer in the United States Army and left active duty as a brigadier general. Then in 2008, Dr. Forsyth became the 20th president of Westminster College. He holds a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and has been a national leader in the academic study and teaching of assessment, leadership, higher education, and psychology. Dr. Forsyth is married to Jane. They have 2 grown children and 3 grandchildren. Please give a warm welcome to our president, Dr. Barney Forsyth.
Thank you very much, Cliff, and thank you for your great work in chairing the committee and for all the work that you did in putting this fabulous symposium together. And as you can see, we are in store for an especially wonderful symposium on a topic that is both timeless and timely. These next 2 days, in particular, will be great days to be Blue Jays. Thanks to the great work of this committee, to our plenary speakers, and to our breakout speakers. Programs like this one, where we all come together as a community to learn from one another, make Westminster so special. Westminster is also made special by the ways that we support one another. And I would like to pause at this time in order to recognize one very significant example of that support. Jim and Sharon Herod have traveled to be with us today, traveled from Dallas, Texas, their home, to learn with us during this symposium. And I would like to invite Jim and Sharon to join me on the stage at this moment. Jim and Sharon, please come. Jim is a member of the Westminster class of 1957, and he had a distinguished career with Edward Jones and has served on our Board of Trustees for 17 years. Sharon has made Westminster her adopted school and is just as passionate about the Blue Jay Nation as is Jim. Sharon and Jim are part of our family, and they've supported the college in more ways than can be enumerated here. And they have elected to fund a professorship in honor of C.S. Lewis, the author and lay theologian who brought us such classics as the Chronicles of Narnia, Mere Christianity, and the Screwtape Letters, to name just a few. The Herod C.S. Lewis Professor of Religious Studies will research, write, and teach on the history, current condition, and future of religion here at Westminster College. The professor will be a leader among the faculty, a mentor to students, and a prominent scholar in his or her field. The professorship will eventually be endowed and will become the Herod C.S. Lewis Endowed Chair. To make something like this happen takes a very significant and sacrificial amount of support. This is a big deal and is happening purely because of the love Jim and Sharon have for Westminster College. We have no way to adequately thank you for this important and significant contribution to our learning community. But I thought having an auditorium full of students, faculty, staff, and friends join me in standing and giving you a standing ovation to say thanks for your great support. Thank you, Jim and Sharon. Thank you very much. Now, before we move on, we have one other big announcement. I just described the Herod C.S. Lewis Professorship as being important to our work here at Westminster. The expectations are very high, the impact will be profound, and I am pleased to announce that we have just the right person for the job. Upon the recommendation of the Faculty Personnel Committee and the Dean of Faculty, I am pleased to announce that Dr. Cliff Cain has been appointed the Herod C.S. Lewis Professor of Religious Studies. Congratulations. As you've heard, Dr. Cain has distinguished himself as a campus leader and a favorite among students, faculty, and staff, and is this year's chair of the committee. His scholarly interests include world religions and interfaith dialogue, contemporary theology, environmental issues, and the conversation between science and religion. He is the author of 6 academic books, 6 collections of sermons, and many journal articles. And he puts theory into practice, serving as a theologian in residence at the First Presbyterian Church in Jefferson City, and he's an active counselor and member of our campus ministry here at Westminster. We are fortunate that Dr. Cain is able to step into this new endowed professorship. And so again, congratulations, Cliff. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jim McCrae, who will introduce our first plenary speaker. Thank you very much, Jim.
Aloha. Dr. J. Baird Callicott holds a PhD in philosophy from Syracuse University and is Distinguished Regents Professor of Philosophy at the University of North Texas. He's one of the founding fathers of the discipline of environmental ethics, teaching the world's first course on that subject in 1971. Dr. Callicott has served the International Society for Environmental Ethics as president and Yale University as bioethicist in resident. He's the foremost expert on Aldo Leopold's land ethic, which is one of the most dominant normative paradigms in contemporary environmental ethics and spiritual ecology. He's the author or editor of a score of books, including Earth's Insights, In Defense of the Land Ethic, and Beyond the Land Ethic. The anthology, Nature in Asian Traditions of Thought, which he co-edited with Roger Ames, was the world's first book on the subject of comparative environmental philosophy, and I'm honored to be his co-editor for that book's forthcoming sequel. Dr. Callicott joined us for the 2007 Westminster Symposium on the topic of the environment, and we are privileged to have him with us once again. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Baird Callicott.
Good morning, everyone. President Forsyth, Dean Perry, Professor Cain, the committee, I want to thank you all for this wonderful privilege and opportunity to speak to you this morning. I am indeed honored, and it is a great pleasure. I'd like to talk a little bit about the origins of environmental ethics as an academic field of study. As Joe mentioned just now, the first college course was offered at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. The first papers in the field were published in 1973 and 1975 by Arnie Ness, an Australian philosopher, Richard Routley, and Holmes Ralston III, with, interestingly, question marks in the title of 2 of them. Is there a need for a new and environmental ethic, and is there an ecological ethic? The first journal in the field was established in 1979, called Environmental Ethics, founded by Eugene C. Hargrove, who remains the editor, and I'm proud to say that it is published at the University of North Texas, which has become the sort of academic center for environmental philosophy in the whole world. These are the images of the founders there. Notice me over there in the corner. My son now is 45 years old, so that kind of dates everything here, doesn't it? What was the context through which environmental ethics as a field of study first emerged? Most significantly, it was a response to the environmental crisis of the 1960s. Oil spills on beaches in Spain, significantly off the coast of Santa Barbara, an offense to all of the people who lived there, and it stimulated the first interdisciplinary academic studies program at the University of California in Santa Barbara. Rivers polluted with municipal and industrial waste. I grew up in Memphis, Tennessee on the Mississippi River, and I can remember back in the day when you would like to, recreate or go swimming on the river. It was impossible because it was so filthy. There was indiscriminate use of pesticides, smog over major cities, Los Angeles and Houston. Then there was also a crisis literature which sort of galvanized public attention. Most famously, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, published in 1962, The Quiet Crisis by Stuart Udall, who was Secretary of the Interior during the Kennedy administration. And I think that by titling his book The Quiet Crisis, there was a kind of muted allusion to the noisy crisis, and that touches directly on Westminster College and its association with Winston Churchill. The noisy crisis would have been the potential for a nuclear holocaust. So here, the environmental situation was compared with one of our most threatening possible eventualities in the 1950s and 60s. Then there was unrest on college campuses. Protests against the war in Vietnam, the Southern Civil Rights Movement, and that produced a demand for relevancy among college students. Some felt, here we are studying Plato and Shakespeare in the classroom. By the way, I teach courses in Plato, so I'm by no means denigrating such studies. But at the same time, things were going to hell in a handbasket on the college campuses, and students said, we need to have our professors address these issues in the classroom. Then, too, there were photos of beautiful planet Earth taken by the Apollo 8, 10, and 11 astronauts, including by the late Neil Armstrong from the moon. Among my liberal colleagues and associates in the late 60s and 70s, it was fashionable to bemoan the waste of money on these fanciful moonshots and explorations of space, while the money could have been better spent on inner city problems, or so the story went. And I was ever the contrarian, saying, no, that program is worth every penny spent on it because of the consciousness raising that these photographs of the Earth created. And then sort of bringing all of this to a kind of critical head was the first National Earth Day in 1970, which was sponsored by Representative Pete McCloskey, a Republican from California, and Senator Gaylord Nelson, a Democrat from Wisconsin. And on my campus in Wisconsin, Stevens Point, Earth Day was an event which called out so many emotions and so many ideas that the gymnasium was filled with an audience this size from 8 in the morning until midnight, with speaker after speaker coming out and declaring a sort of new consciousness for the environment. So that's the wrong direction here. Here are a few images to tell the story. Rachel Carson and so on. I won't dwell over those. Now, I think that the agenda-setting seminal text of environmental ethics, and this brings us now to the theme of the relationship of religion in environmental ethics, was titled The Historical Roots of Our Ecologic Crisis by Lynn White Jr., and it was published in Science, one of the most prestigious science journals in the world, in 1967. Now, White's argument was very provocative. He begins with the banal observation that the environmental crisis is a product of modern technology. And we want to make sure that we understand that technology is as old as humanity. Flake stones, sharpened sticks, bows and arrows are technologies. But what makes modern technology unique and all-powerful is that it is informed by science, which previously had been pursued as a kind of elitist activity, knowledge for knowledge's sake, beginning in the 18th century. So an aggressive technology and the scientific revolution, White goes on to observe, began in Christendom, that is to say in Western Europe in the late Middle Ages. And the Judeo-Christian worldview, which dominated Western Europe at that time, was that worldview, and therefore, he concluded, the historical roots of our ecologic crisis are traceable to the Judeo-Christian biblical worldview. So, that worldview is set out in Genesis 1. And if we look at Genesis 1 analytically, it tells us that God creates the world in the course of 6 days. On the first day, light, day and night. Second day, the firmament, which is an opening or a gap between heaven and earth. Third day, dry land and seas, plants, grasses, herbs, and trees. Fourth day, sun, moon, stars, planets, days, seasons, years, time. The heavenly bodies are the instruments of time. On the sixth day, the fifth day, animals, fish, fowl, whales, cattle, creeping things, beasts are named. All of this from the King James Version of the Bible, by the way, which remains my favorite. And on day 6, man. And the key passages here upon which all attention is focused were just 3 verses of the Bible. Genesis 1, 26 through 28. First of all, man is created in God's image to have dominion over the animals. Both male and female were created in the image of God, and then God commands them, the first man and woman, to be fruitful and multiply, to replenish the earth, and 3, have dominion over every living thing. Well, there's famously in the Sistine Chapel this representation of the relationship of man to God. So we may begin then to question White's thesis sort of in its middle domain. It's perhaps not so mysterious how the Judeo-Christian worldview might have inspired aggressive technologies. We could imagine that Christians simply lived out this worldview and guided their behavior by this original unnumbered commandment to have dominion over creation and to subdue it. And this obviously explains the development of aggressive technologies. And White himself was by trade an academic, a medieval historian of technology, so this was sort of his field. And he cites water-powered mills, the iron mold-bored plow, which took 8 oxen to pull and aggressively tore into the body of the earth. Now, how the Judeo-Christian worldview inspired science is a little bit more problematic because we do have the common experience that science and religion are somewhat at odds in their conception of the world, but White maintains, no, quite the contrary, that it was this theistic context which made scientific inquiry possible. And this through the image of God, because it explains the possibility and motivation for scientific knowledge. If God is the designer and artificer of nature, and we are created in his image, then we should be able to discover the design principles God used to create nature. Newton, by the way, described himself not as a scientist, the word actually didn't materialize until the 19th century as such, but as a natural theologian, and many of the scientists of the 17th century proclaimed that they were thinking God's thoughts after him, a direct quotation. And in today's terminology, we could say that basically Newton and Galileo set out to reverse engineer God's great machine. So White then, and this is not too strong a way of putting it, blames the Judeo-Christian worldview for the environmental crisis. Modern science-driven technology has given us many wonderful things: PowerPoint presentations, electricity, but it has also had some serious environmental side effects, many of which were noticed in the 60s, and now, of course, it's global warming and the possibility of a sixth great extinction. If so, and these are not my words, these are, I want to make sure, these are Lynn White Jr.'s. Christianity bears a huge burden of guilt. The Judeo-Christian worldview replaced nature-worshiping old world paganism. Therefore, Christianity, once again a quote, is the most anthropocentric religion the world has seen. We are superior to nature, contemptuous of it, willing to use it for our slightest whim. And then he goes on to say, more science and more technology are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. First of all, before I return to the religious theme, I would like to suggest how this article really set the agenda for future environmental philosophy. If you look beneath the lurid and cavalier environmental critique of the Judeo-Christian worldview, there is a more general subtext repeated again and again as a kind of refrain. White says, "What shall we do? No one yet knows unless we think about fundamentals. Our specific measures may produce backlashes." Then he observes or claims, "What people do about their ecology," that's a misuse of the word ecology, their environment, depends on what they think about themselves in relation to the things around them. What we do about ecology, the environment, depends on our ideas of the man-nature relationship. We must rethink and refeel our nature and destiny. So whose professional job is it to think about fundamentals? Well, philosophers, that's who. In the early 1970s, White made some of us philosophers feel like only we could save the world from a worsening environmental crisis. I know it's ridiculously hubristic, but because, as he said, to do anything effective about it depended on first thinking about the man-nature relationship, or so White insisted. I'm not, by the way, suggesting that this relationship between what we do and what we think is itself unproblematic, but at the point we didn't really reflect on this. This was, like I say, a kind of sub-theme that was subliminal in his text. So here was the agenda for a future environmental philosophy. We have, first of all, critique our inherited ideas about human nature, about nature, and the human-nature relationship. And not all of these ideas are biblical by any means. When the early scientists were thinking God's thoughts after him, they weren't thinking biblical thoughts. They were thinking ancient Greek science thoughts, atomism, and ancient astronomy, and so on. So then, of course, there's Plato's philosophy with his otherworldly investing reality in these abstract ideas and denigrating the reality under our eyes and under our feet. What about Cartesian dualism, which posits this radical differentiation between our bodies and our minds and our souls? Newton represents nature as a vast machine, a mechanism, but really it might not be a mechanism, more like an organism. And then Lockean notions of private property basically say that things are worthless unless we invest our labor in them, and it's only labor that provides any value to other things, and they're just natural resources. And then the second thing, and this is far more difficult, is to think up new, better, more environment-friendly ideas about the same things, human nature, nature, and the human-nature relationship. Now back from environmental philosophy and its general program to a new environmental Christian theology. White presented environmentally concerned Christians and Jews with a sticky dilemma. Either abandon their religious beliefs or abandon their ecological concerns. So theologians went immediately to work their way between the horns of that dilemma, following up on White's suggestion to rethink our old religion. White made a stab at that by nominating St. Francis of Assisi as the patron saint of ecologists, and Pope John Paul II actually did that in 1979. So he's had some influence, I should say. According to White, Francis tried to depose man from his monarchy over creation and set up a democracy of all creatures. But that path wasn't the predominant one taken by the theological Christian and what I call here somewhat perhaps overly lumping the Judeo-Christian worldview. What emerged really was the Judeo-Christian stewardship environmental ethic. The more powerful response from Christians and Jewish environmental thinkers was to challenge White's interpretation of Genesis 1. Now notice, first after his day's creation work on days 3, 4, and 5, God saw that what he created was good. The earth itself, the sun, moon, planets and stars, plants and animals. Now that could be interpreted as God conferring what environmental philosophers call intrinsic value on the creation. That is to say, the creation has more than use value. Second, being created in the image of God entails responsibilities as well as privileges. We humans are indeed entitled to use nature, but not, quoting White again, for our slightest whim, nor certainly in ways that destroy or disfigure nature. Third, and what does it mean to have dominion over the creation? Dominion historically means rule or governance, but there's a difference between despotic rule and beneficent rule. The creation remains God's, not man's. So the kind of rule that God intended was that of a steward or caretaker of a lord's household or property. And to make a contemporary reference, I say, well, think Carson the Butler on Downton Abbey, if any of you are nerdy enough to watch that PBS series. The stewardship interpretation of dominion is confirmed by Genesis 2:15. So if we want to know what dominion means from the Bible itself, we find in Genesis 2:15 God putting Adam, the first man, into the Garden of Eden to dress and keep it. And fourth, we simply have to ignore the part of God's commandment that enjoins man not only replenish the earth, which we could interpret as an adaptive management, ecological stewardship, but also to subdue it. We'll just forget about that. The Judeo-Christian stewardship environmental ethic is theoretically elegant and eminently practicable. It solves the central and gnarly theoretical problem of environmental ethics, which has preoccupied most of us for the history of the discipline, about the intrinsic value of nature. And that's simply by divine fiat. God declares the creation to be good, period. It solves the problem of reciprocity. Why should we be nice to nature if nature is not nice back to us? And it's not. Nature and all its creatures have no moral responsibilities to us. The image of God solves that problem. We're created in it, and they're not. So we have moral responsibility to them, but they have none to us. And thirdly, this is a little bit technical, but most important, it's holistic. It's clear that when God is creating plants and animals and declaring them to be good, he is creating species, not specimens, so we can in good conscience kill and eat other creatures as long as we preserve and replenish their species, their kinds. Now, there are problems with the Judeo-Christian stewardship environment. I think it's embedded in the Judeo-Christian worldview. It requires subscribers to believe in God, as portrayed in the Bible, believe that God created the world, believe that man is created in the image of God. The Judeo-Christian worldview is not consistent with the contemporary scientific worldview, in which the Earth is a planet at the center of the universe. The cosmos took shape over many eons, not in 6 days. Man is, from a scientific point of view, one of 6 species of great ape and has no privileged status. And it doesn't appeal to even all religious people. The worldview is shared more or less by Muslims, but not by Buddhists, Hindus, Jains, Taoists, Confucians, etc. Now, White also stimulated comparative environmental philosophy, which Jim and I are engaged in. Before suggesting a way to rethink our old religion by adopting St. Francis of Assisi's theology, White hinted at what it might mean to find a new religion. He says, this is a direct quote in passing, the beatniks, does anybody know who beatniks are? They were prior to the hippies, right? So, who are the basic revolutionaries of our time, show a sound instinct in their affinity for Zen Buddhism, which conceives of the man-nature relationship as very nearly the mirror image of the Christian worldview. The most famous of the beatniks was Allen Ginsberg, and there's a little picture of him and his friends in San Francisco during the late 1950s, and that's Daisetsu Suzuki, who popularized Zen Buddhism in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. So why comparative environmental philosophy? There soon followed essays like Tao Now, by Houston Smith. But White had rejected the prospect of finding a new religion and everyone converting to Taoism and Zen Buddhism because, as he says, Zen, Taoism, Hinduism, Confucianism, however, is as deeply conditioned by Asian history as Christianity is by the experience of the West, and I am dubious of its validity among us. But who is us, Kimosabe? White assumed his audience to be limited to those conditioned by Western history. But the environmental crisis is global in scope. If Christian thinkers could tease a coherent and powerful environmental ethic out of the Judeo-Christian worldview for Christians, Jews and Muslims, then might not thinkers in other religious traditions tease coherent and powerful environmental ethics out of their worldviews for their various communities of faith? So that then led to the advent that Jim alluded to in the mid-1980s of comparative environmental philosophy. And I was involved in the development of this view as well. I got a fellowship to an NEH-sponsored 6-week summer institute for comparative philosophy at the University of Hawaii in 1984. Now remember, I was then at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, so I wasn't really that interested in comparative philosophy. It was something else that motivated my application. I convinced key institute faculty that they had much to contribute to the new field of environmental philosophy. So we organized a series of sessions at the American Philosophical Association, the American Academy of Religion, on the theme Conceptual Resources for Environmental Ethics in Asian Traditions of Thought, and published some of the conference papers and special issues of Philosophy East and West, which was the leading journal in the field of comparative philosophy, published out of the University of Hawaii, and Environmental Ethics. The best of those papers were collected in a volume, which Jim mentioned earlier, titled Nature and Asian Traditions of Thought, that I edited with Roger T. Ames. Now, I'm trying to give you a little chronology of my aging as well as, so here's, that was back in the 1980s, okay? And isn't that a beautiful cover for that book? And the sections are the ecological worldview, the Chinese worldview, and so on, as parts of that text. It's still in print, by the way, published in 1989 from SUNY University, SUNY Press. Building on the foundations provided by Nature and Asian Traditions of Thought and my previous work in American Indian environmental ethics, I undertook a global survey of the potential for ecological ethics in the principal world religions and select indigenous traditions in a book titled Earth's Insights, which was published in 1994 and has recently been translated in French, Japanese, and Spanish. The chapter titles are listed below. They include, an introduction to environmental ethics, Western environmental attitudes, South Asian traditions, East Asian traditions, South American, African, Australian, and so on. I was thinking about titling this book A Cook's Tour of, the old Cook's Tour was one of these things you're signed on to, and they hustled you around one place or another. And the people used to say what a Cook's Tour was like, this is Thursday, so we must be in Rome. So this is chapter 6, we must be in India, or something like that. It was kind of a quick read there. And there is the book cover. It's published in French as Pensées de la Terre, and it's published in Japanese by a title I cannot pronounce, so Jim may be able to, I don't know. Now, as comparative environmental philosophy matures, it went well beyond the tiny efforts that I made in its development. In the late 1990s, the Harvard Center for the Study of World Religions held a series of 10 conferences in 3 years, organized by Mary Evelyn Tucker on religion and ecology. Leading thinkers in each of the communities of faith were invited to construct an environmental ethic from the conceptual resources of their religious worldviews. And Harvard University Press has now published the fruits of those conferences in a series titled Religions of the World and Ecology. And there you see the titles: Buddhism and Ecology, Confucianism and Ecology, Christianity, Hinduism, Taoism, and so on, through the list of world religions. So that's a marvelous resource. Why comparative environmental philosophy? Well, as now I can call him this, as old Lynn White Jr. long ago noted, it is quite unlikely that we will all convert to Hinduism, Buddhism, or Taoism. That the West, Europe, and Neo-Europe, as one scholar calls it, will adopt one of these foreign worldviews. But as anyone who has traveled to West, South, or East Asia will attest, those peoples, cultures, and civilizations could use an environmental ethic quite as much as the peoples, cultures, and civilizations of the West. A Hindu environmental ethic is for Hindus, just as a Taoist environmental ethic is for Taoists, and so on for all the rest. Now this then, once we have all of these, like, as sort of concretized in this marvelous series of books by Harvard University Press, once we have these environmental ethics worked out in various religious traditions, we confront what I call the one-many problem. And I have a chapter on this in Earth's Insights. The environmental crisis is global in scope. Many, if not most, of our environmental problems are transboundary, trespassing geographical boundaries, political boundaries, cultural boundaries, religious boundaries. All these religion-based environmental ethics are embedded in very different and mutually contradictory worldviews. God doesn't exist in Buddhism or Taoism. For Taoists, there is the impersonal Tao, or way. For Buddhists, there is ultimately the holy sunyata, or emptiness. All these religions are not just saying the same thing in different words. There is no common denominator of belief running through them all, at least not in any well-articulated doctrine. But to be effective and successful, all of them have to work together in perfect harmony to meet the challenge of the environmental crisis. My favorite example is the migration of the Siberian crane. It breeds in shamanist Siberia. It migrates to southern India. It crosses through Russian Orthodox Russia, Muslim Afghanistan and Pakistan, Hindu India, northern India, and into Sri Lanka, the home of Theravada Buddhism. So in order to coordinate the conservation of this one species, somehow we have to be on we have to have a common language and a set of values in order to organize this. So this leads then to a science-based environmental ethics. There is, I think, a common international belief system that is as global in scope as the environmental crisis, and that's international science. Science may have originated in Western Christendom, as White claims, but it is now thoroughly international. Scientists, for example, studying volcanoes in Beijing, New Delhi, Osaka, Berkeley, Lisbon, Mexico City, anywhere in the world, share a single worldview, a single epistemology, the scientific method, a single set of criteria for distinguishing good from bad science, and communicate with one another around the world in a common language, mathematics most basically by means, and English, by means of international conferences, peer-reviewed journals, and increasingly via the internet. So I'm suggesting that we privilege this international cross-cultural scientific worldview. Science tells us a new story about the nature of nature, human nature, and the relationship between humans and nature. Now, I want to say it's only a story among stories, like the story told in Genesis or in the Bhagavad Gita. We human beings, we try to model the world with our minds, but what we are directly accessing is simply our model of the world. It always lies beyond. And that's what I mean by a story. Science, the science story tells us about the origin and structure of the unimaginably vast and old universe, about the formation of the earth, about the evolution of life on earth, about the way life on earth works ecologically, about human evolution. The science story, as I claim, is just another story among more ancient stories, but I also want to suggest it's a better story. because it's logically self-consistent, while others often are not. If you are a careful student of Genesis, you will realize that there are two mutually contradictory accounts of creation there. It comprehends all the known facts of observation, collected with telescopes, microscopes, magnetic resonance imaging, etc., and it's self-correcting, always in the process of revision and re-editing as new facts or data are discovered. Now, Aldo Leopold, I think, is whom I've devoted a great deal to, whose work I have devoted a great deal of attention, developed a science-based environmental ethic that he called the land ethic. He writes, all ethics so far evolved, notice, rest upon a single premise that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts. Ecology simply enlarges the boundaries of the community to include soils, waters, plants, and animals, or collectively land. A land ethic changes the role of Homo sapiens from conqueror of the land community to plain member and citizen of it. It implies respect for his fellow members and also respect for the community as such. And he concludes with this as kind of a golden rule or summary moral maxim: a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. So in my book, Earth's Insights, I suggest that the land ethic be a kind of, and this is a bit of a leap of a metaphor here, a Rosetta Stone for all the world's religious environmental ethics. It can be the arbiter when their indications are in conflict. And science and religion can work together in the following way. Science can validate the ecological insights that are so well represented in indigenous traditions of thought that we call it by an acronym, TEK, Traditional Ecological Knowledge. Ecologists are often astonished to find that after many years of research and trial and error and wrong theories, that they look at what indigenous people have come up with and, wow, that's the solution all along, right? And then when science underwrites that and affirms it, it gives authority to these pre-scientific sources of wisdom. The language of science, moreover, is abstract, mathematical, and inaccessible to most laypersons and to most students. The language of traditional religion is vivid and concrete and metaphorical. Thus, religious vocabulary, imagery, and parable can help tell the new science story and the moral of that story, the evolutionary ecological land ethic, and communicate this to the general public. I was lecturing this summer in Paris at UNESCO precisely on a project like this to be able to communicate science in what they call narrative form, story form. I think that there is furthermore a little explored religious potential of science, and Aldo Leopold sensed that there was this untapped spirituality in science itself. People often ask me, as an expert on Leopold, what were his religious convictions? His wife was Catholic. Was he a Buddhist? And I say, no. His religion was natural history. For example, he writes, it is a century now since Darwin gave us the first glimpse of the origin of species. We know now what was unknown to all the preceding caravan generations, that men are only fellow voyagers with other creatures in the odyssey of evolution. This new knowledge should have given us, by this time, a sense of kinship with other creatures, a wish to live and let live, a sense of wonder over the magnitude and duration of the biotic enterprise. But the evolutionary process has no goal or direction, nor any exalted place in it for Homo sapiens. is no cause for despair, despite Woody Allen, who has made a career of lamenting that there's no meaning of life in the modern world. Rather, we should exult in our good fortune and take pride in being the most recent experiment in a process that began 3.5 billion years ago. So the little explored religious potential of science has now been, I think, captured popularly and available in a more systematic way through the Catholic theologian, doubtless a heretic, Thomas Berry, who teamed up with physicist Brian Swimme to write a new universe story, and they deliberately presented as an alternative to the Genesis story, expanding Leopold's spiritual reflections on evolution and ecology from the planetary to cosmic proportions. And they call it the universe story. I don't know if you can read it from here, but the subtitle is From the Primordial Flaring Forth to the Ecozoic Era, a celebration of the unfolding of the cosmos. Brian Swimme teamed up with Mary Evelyn Tucker, whom I mentioned before, to produce a PBS quality documentary film telling the new story of science with talking head on screen narration by Brian Swimme. He's a charismatic guy with graphics and special effects, so you see the cosmos unfolding here as they render it. So here's the conclusion. This is the slide everyone is relieved to see. Lynn White Jr. stimulated the development of religion-based environmental ethics with his critique of the environmental implications of the Judeo-Christian biblical worldview. Judeo-Christian apologists, that means defenders of the faith, responded with the intellectually elegant and powerful Judeo-Christian, I should add, practicable Judeo-Christian stewardship environmental ethic. White also suggested that there might be the potential for environmental ethics in Zen Buddhism, which stimulated the development of environmental ethics in Buddhism and many other Asian traditions of thought. And religious pluralism in environmental ethics might be unified by making a Rosetta Stone out of the science-based land ethic of Aldo Leopold, and the science-based Leopold land ethic is itself one among many religious environmental ethics, because there is a spiritual potential in science that he tapped into, and that has been explored by Berry et al. So that's all, folks, but stay tuned for a brand new book titled Environmental Philosophy in Asian Traditions of Thought, edited by me and Westminster's own Jim McRae. And there's Jim looking about like I did in that first image that I showed you back in the day. Okay, thank you very much.